Hello. Before we begin, a quick note. The Bore You to Sleep podcast relies on you and sponsors, which means you will hear a quick advertisement before the beginning of tonight's episode. While the podcast is free, you are welcome to subscribe for just $2.99 per month, which supports the creation of this podcast and gives you an ad-free listening experience. Simply click the link in the show notes from your podcast app. Rest easy. Hello. Welcome to the Bore You to Sleep podcast. The podcast that will hopefully help you get to sleep. I am going to read an open source book, one that is not particularly interesting, but one that is hopefully boring enough to get you to sleep. Tonight's reading comes from Staffordshire Pottery and its History. This book looks at the history of pottery in Staffordshire, how it was introduced, and how it became renowned for it. Written by Josiah C. Wedgwood, this story was published in 1913. My name is Teddy, and I aim to help people everywhere get a good night's rest. Sleep is so important, and my mission is to help you get the rest you need. The podcast is designed to play in the background while you slowly fall asleep. As we head toward the holiday season, I would like to say thank you to each and every one of you. I started this podcast back in January of 2019, and it is touching to know how many people it has helped since then. Whether you've only recently started listening or you've been along for the whole journey, I appreciate you. I realize it can be a happy time of the year for many, but I also realize that it may not be so for others. Wherever you are and whatever you are doing, I send you my best wishes and I hope that you are well. Thank you to everyone who shared their words of gratitude with me during the week, whether through the website or your podcast app. Your messages mean the world to me. A special thank you to all new subscribers to the podcast, whether you have subscribed by clicking on the link in the show notes or via Patreon. Your support is what allows me to keep bringing out new episodes for those who need them. I also want to thank listeners who reached out via the website. Your messages and feedback are so appreciated. My goal is to keep this podcast free and accessible to everyone. Support from listeners via Patreon and Spotify plays a crucial role. If you find the podcast beneficial and would like to support it, here are a few ways you can contribute. Follow the podcast in your podcast app and leave a comment. Become a subscriber for $2.99 per month. This supports episode creation, and you can do so easily by clicking on the link in the show notes. If subscribing is not possible, an easy way to help is simply by leaving a review and rating in your podcast app. Even one sentence really helps out. To support the show with a monthly contribution, you can visit boreyoutosleep.com. Patreon is a great way to do this, and visiting the website is also a great way to say hello to me. If you know someone out there who is also struggling with sleep, please ensure that you let them know about this podcast. It might just help them get the night of rest that they deserve. In the meantime, lie back, relax, and enjoy the readings. Staffordshire Pottery and its History by Josiah C. Wedgwood. Preface. This account of the potting industry in North Staffordshire will be of interest chiefly to the people of North Staffordshire. They and their fathers before them have grown up with, lived with, made and developed the English pottery trade. The pot bank and the shard ruck are, to them, as familiar and as full of old associations as the cowshed to the countryman, or the nets along the links to the fishing population. To them any history of the development of their industry will be welcome. But potting is such a specialized industry, so confined to and associated with North Staffordshire, that it is possible to study very clearly in the case of this industry the cause of its localization, and its gradual change from a home to a factory business. The rise of capitalism, the attempts at revolt on the part of the workers, the increase of machinery and steam power, all these can be studied very closely in the potting industry, just because the history of the district is the history of potting and of the inhabitants' whole lives. So that I venture to hope that many students of history and of sociology will find such a trade history as this of some value in their researches. The collector, too, may I hope find his special studies, assisted by the identification and linking together of the relationships of the old master potters, of their inventions and factory sites and dates. 100 years ago, Simeon Shaw wrote a book of this nature. It had its merits, but since then, research among ancient documents, systematic collection and excavation, the publications of the William Salt Archaeological Society, and above all, the modern work of such men as William Burton and Professor Church, have made it possible to restate far more exactly what happened, and when, to potting in North Staffordshire. Mr. Burton's history and description of English earthenware, and his various works on porcelain, have been drawn upon very largely in the following pages. Both to him and to Professor Church, M. Solon, and to many others, who have given me so much personal assistance in this work, I desire to express my gratitude. I can only regret that my own contribution to original research on the subject has been confined to the Tunstall Court rolls, kindly lent me by Mr. Snade, and to the MSS of my great-great-grandfather, Josiah Wedgwood, now in the museum of the Wedgwood firm at Etruria. Lastly, I would express my indebtedness to my brother Frank Wedgwood, who has read through the proofs and made many corrections, such as would occur to one whose whole life has been devoted to the practice of the art of potting. Chapter 1. The Creation of the Potteries. In no country is there a district so utterly associated with one trade as is the North Staffordshire Potteries. One even speaks of the potteries in the singular as of a pure place name. If you spoke in Timbuktu or California of the potteries, none could doubt that you were thinking of North Staffordshire. The reason is not that the district is or ever was given over entirely to pot banks. Potting was incidental, a pastime in the middle of agriculture. As potting grew, so coal and iron mining grew too. The district is less confined to potting than Walsall to saddlery, or Sheffield to knives. Even a 13th century reference to Walsall will expose harness. It is difficult to trace pots in the potteries before 1650, you find only bloom smithies and sea coal mines. Potting is neither so ancient here nor so exclusive as to have made the name. The real reason of the place name, the Potteries, is that no man who valued time could say Tunstall, Burslem, Hanley, Stoke, and Longton, whenever he wanted to refer to one place. The place where men made pots. And few people outside the Five Towns ever wanted to speak of them separately, or could even distinguish one from others. The first reference to potteries will be found in the latter half of the 18th century. Before that time it was hardly necessary to refer to them at all. The area where pots were made in North Staffordshire has always been peculiarly local and circumscribed. It extends and extended in a line from Golden Hill to Mere Lane End. Occasionally, at times, we hear of potworks at Red or Ridge Street, at Bagnall or at Bucknell, outside this narrow area. They only receded finally from Chesterton during the last century, but generally speaking, Staffordshire potters have resisted always in making pots, just where their fathers made them before, in the hilly land between the Fulhay Brook and the sources of the Trent. There was no need in old times for the people who made pots to specialize in one district. The art of potting is as old and as universal as the art of cooking. In old times it was as simple. Like most modern trades, it was practiced at first, and anywhere, as a branch of housekeeping. Every family made what pots they required for their kitchen, and one can see such rude earthenware utensils among the miscellanea of any excavation. And like most modern trades, the development from the housekeeping to the manufacturing stage meant specialization in particular districts. But why should potting have settled in the potteries? So long as all that was wanted was clay and firewood, almost any place would do. In England, it was about the year 1600 that the time arrived when brushwood became rare and costly. Clay and coal were then found to be the necessaries of a potteries. North Staffordshire had both. Burslem, and it is Burslem alone which one need consider in this problem of the first cause, had something more than clay and coal. The land was split up into one great number of a small copyhold owners, and immediately after 1600 the copyholds were enfranchised. There were no domain lands. The people were independent, both of big farmers and of great landlords. There was security of tenure and every opportunity for initiative which could not take the shape of intensive cultivation. So we find in Burslem and Tunstall, at the beginning of the 17th century, clay, coal, and the opportunity. By the end of that century, the next requisite was to hand skilled workmen. By the end of the next century, the last requisite of trade was in place, the cheap water transport of the Trent and Mersey Canal. It is well known that the safest way to test the presence in early days of particular trades or forms of employment is to study any local lists of the surnames of common people of the 13th and 14th centuries. We find our first such list for the manor of Tunstall, which included Burslem in 1299. not a single name that one can associate with potting is to be found. A similar list for Audley of the same date shows a Robert Le Potter, Thomas Pottinger, and Richard Le Thrower. Probably most similar lists for that date would provide some such solitary reference to so common a trade, and I do not jump from this to the conclusion that Audley was the real mother of the potteries. There are subsidy rolls giving Tunstall taxpayers in 1327 and 1333. Still no potter is to be found. We have also now available a varied selection of the Tunstall Court rolls. The earliest 1326 has nothing that one can twist into a reference to potting, but when we can collect in subsequent years the following: 1348, William the Potter gives 6d for license to make earthen pots. 1353, Thomas the Throger is immersed for a default at Chatterley. 1363, John Pottier is presented for an affray in Burslem. 1369, Le Potter gives 12d for license to get earth for making pots until the following Michaelmas. 1372, Thomas Le Thrower takes up land in Thursfield. 1405, Robert Potter is recently dead in Burslem. 1448, Richard Adams and William his brother are immersed for digging clay in the common road between Sneyd and Burslem. In several of these leases of land, by copy of court roll of the 15th and 16th century, the right to dig marl or clay is conceded, but I suspect it was usual even then to use such marl as manure. The filling in of pits or lakes in the roads is also a constant cause of trouble in these rolls, but they may have been due to honest wear and tear, and not to the temptations of a cheap raw material. It should be mentioned, however, that we have hardly 1/4 of these early Tunstall Court rolls, and must not assume that these few casual notices of clay or pots is exhaustive. We now skip a century and pass to 1549. The jurors present Richard Deniel for that he dug mud called clay in the King's Way at Bolashane and in Burslem. 1604. Penalty laid. It is ordained by the jury that any person who digs clay in a certain way called Wall Lane, which shall be prejudicial to the passage by that way, or if he do not fill up the same well and sufficiently, shall forfeit to the Lord. So far still no mention of potting. Various leisured people began now to describe England, relating what they saw and heard. Many of them dealt with Staffordshire, but they noticed no special and curious feature about the North Staffordshire moorlands. Leyland in 1537, Camden in 1586, Erdswick in 1590, say nothing of a potteries. Speed's list of the Shire products in 1625 omits pottery. It is just possible that some of the impetus for the local manufacture may have come from the dissolution of the monasteries. There is no reason to believe, judging from the remains at the Cistercian Abbey of Hulton, that the monks there made such encaustic tiles as are to this day called Cistercian. Now Hulton Abbey and the Abbey's Grange of Rushton both lie in Burslem parish. Some rudimentary practice in the art and mystery of potting, may well have come from the 7 scattering brethren of the dissolved monastery, and may account in part for the development which was to come. For now we begin to find potters thick on the ground in Burslem. In legal documents, the practice grew of adding, after any man's name, his trade, leases, depositions, wills, all show this. After 1600, one would certainly expect to find some trade description, and at last in 1616 we find our first potters. 1616, Richard Middleton demises to Thomas Daniel of Burslem Senior, potter, a pasture called Brown Hills, and another pasture called the Hill in Burslem containing 3 acres, with right to dig clay, filling up the pits after him for 21 years at a rent of 4 shillings. He demises also to John Lee 3 acres in Withmore, with liberty to dig clay in Withmore when need be. Next year, 1617, William Adams of Burslem describes himself in his will as potter, and among the depositions of witnesses in the Chancery suit of Manwaring v. Shaw of 1640, one of the witnesses, Ralph Simpson of Burslem, aged 80, is described as a potter. Thereafter, every reference to Burslem or Tunstall is replete with potters and earth potters, and men trained to the trade were acquiring the skill necessary for the localization of the coming industry. The men were ready, the clay and coal found together cropping out in the country of the Staffordshire Potteries. The clay, though not now used for earthenware, is and always has been suitable for the saggers in which the ware is packed while being fired, and for the fire bricks of the kiln in which the ware is baked. The coals were so cheap that in 1680 they cost apparently only 16 pennies a ton at the pit's mouth, and although such coal had to be carried usually on horseback, yet it never had to be carried more than 2 miles to reach the pot ovens. One other raw material was wanted: lead. It was the most expensive, almost the only part of the master potter's equipment that required capital. The ore was got at Lawton Park, 6 miles to the north. The capital stock in trade of the early potter is shown by the will of John Clothcow Rowley of Burslem, who died in 1656, leaving to Thomas Wedgwood of the churchyard of Burslem all my pottinge boards and all other necessary implements and materials belonging to the trade of pottinge. This same Thomas Wedgwood was great-grandfather of Josiah Wedgwood, and he, as well as 2 of his brothers, Aaron and Moses, also described themselves in their wills as potters. Burslem by 1670, full of potters, making no doubt butter pots or the commonest of ware. A little further off in the valley of Tinkersclough, Thomas Toft was actually attempting decoration. The Toft dishes are well known. They are signed with the name Thomas Toft or Ralph Toft, written in liquid slip clay upon the plate. They are made of red buff or yellow clay, and other coloured slip clays are dribbled over them through a quill, so as to make pictures of Charles II, or Queen Anne, or a pelican picking its breast to feed its young. Then the whole is dusted over with powdered lead ore, and fired till the lead fuses into the plate and forms a rich yellowish glaze. Some of these productions of what has come to be called the Toft School are dated, There is a candlestick, very elaborate, dated 1649, and claimed for Staffordshire. Shaw mentions 2 dishes, marked one, Thos Sands, and the other, Thos Toft, each dated 1650. M. Solon had seen a slip dish in a cottage in Hanley, bearing the inscription scratched on its back. Thomas Toft, Tinker's Clough, I made it 16-6 dash. A dish with the picture of a soldier bearing a sword in each hand, and inscribed in slip, Ralph Toft, 1677, is also mentioned by M. Solon. Another marked Ralph Toft and bearing the image of a very wasp-waisted lady is in the Salford Museum, dated 1676. Other makers of this school were Thomas and William Sands, Ralph Simpson and William Taylor. They were 2-handled drinking mugs called tyges, with similar decoration, and small model cradles made in clay and slip, presents for young married couples according to their local custom. Puzzle jugs were another freak production, speaking to the humour of the time. The jug was so contrived with multiple spouts and hidden passages as to spill however one tried to drink from it. A sample of these puzzle jugs in stoneware bears the inscription, John Wedgwood, 1691. This man was the eldest son of Thomas Wedgwood, previously mentioned, and did not pot himself. I think this jug was made for him by his nephew, Richard Wedgwood, to whom he both leased the overhouse works and married his daughter and heiress. Several pieces are marked with the name Joseph Glass, who is known to have been a potter in Hanley in 1710 to 1715. All of these early master potters were handy men of many trades. They made their pots in sheds at the backsides of their dwelling houses, alongside the cowshed. They dug their own clay, often in front of their own front doors. The Wedgwoods at least owned and dug their own coal, wherewith to fire the oven. It was a peasant industry carried on by family, among the pigs and fowls, and when they were not making showpieces for presentation, they made butter pots, in which farmers might market their butter in uto exita. At least so, says Dr. Plot. Dr. Plot seems to have visited the potteries in 1677. In 1686 he published his Natural History of Staffordshire. Although he obviously takes the most lively interest in the dances of witches, and that strange chemical process called striking with galls, yet he was also a keen observer, and found time to set down the earliest account, and at the same time an intelligent account of the North Staffordshire potting industry. A contemporary account of this early date must obviously be of great importance, and it is here given in full. In quotation marks, as for tobacco pipe clays, they are found all over the county, whereof they make pipes at Armitage and Lichfield, also at Darlaston, but of late disused, because of better and cheaper found in Monway, betwixt Wednesbury and Willingsworth, which make excellent pipes. And Charles Rigg of Newcastle makes very good pipes of 3 sorts of clay, a white and a blue, which he has from between Shelton and Handley Green. The most preferable clay of any is that of Amblecott, of a dark bluish colour, whereof they make the best pots for the glassed houses of any in England. Other potters' clays for the more common wares there are, at Horsley Heath, Tipton, and in Monway Field. Of these they make divers sorts of vessels of Wednesbury, which they paint with slip made of a reddish sort of earth, gotten at Tipton. But the greatest pottery they have in this county is carried on at Burslem, near Newcastle under Lyme, where for making their several sorts of pots they have as many different sorts of clays, which they dig round about the town, all within half a mile's distance, the best being found nearest the coal, and are distinguished by their colours and uses as followeth. Number 1. Bottle clay, of a bright whitish streaked yellow colour. Number 2. Hard fire clay, of a duller whitish colour, fuller interspersed with a dark yellow, which they use for their black wares, being mixed with the 3. Red blending clay, which is of a dirty red colour, white clay, so called it seems though of a bluish colour, and used for making a yellow coloured ware, because yellow is the lightest colour they make any ware of. Again, in discussing the great dairy produce market at Utto Exeter, at which the cheesemongers of London had thought it worth while to set up a factorage, Plot says, "The factors many mercat days in the season lay out no less than £500 a day, in these two commodities, butter and cheese only. The butter they buy by the pot, of a long cylindrical form, made at Burslem in this county of a certain size, so as not to weigh above 6 pounds at most, and yet to contain at least 14 pounds of butter, according to an Act of Parliament made about 14 to 16 years ago, for regulating the abuses of this trade in the make of the pots and false packing of the butter." Later on, too, he describes how the lead ores are dug in a yellowish stone with cork and spar on the side of Lawton Park, where the workmen distinguish it into 3 sorts, round ore, small ore, and smitham. He describes how the ores are cleaned, which done, it is sold to the potters at Burslem for 6 or 7 pounds per turn. For a contemporary inventory of a nascent industry, Plot's account is extraordinarily full and accurate. It is so important and so unique that no apology need be made for quoting it at length. The pot oven described by Plot would be surrounded by a wall of clods of turf, to keep in the heat, or by a hovel of walls of broken saggers, roofed with boughs and clods of earth. Each pot works consisted of a hovel, such as this, some thatched open sheds for drying the ware, and an open tank or sunpan in which the clay mixed with water was evaporated. These sunpans or sun kilns were 12 to 20 feet long, and wide and about 18 inches deep. One portion partitioned off, and deeper and lined with flagstones, was used for mixing. Here the clay was blunged by a man with a long pole or paddle, and thoroughly mixed with the water. The mixture was then poured through a sieve from the blunging vat into the sunpan. A potworks of almost exactly this description is to be seen today at Garshall Green, near Stone. For making flower pots, even here, however, a pug mill has taken the place of the blunging pole. It was a very raw industry in 1677, What led to the artistic development of pottery in England as a whole was the trading contact with the advancing civilization of Holland and Germany. The English were learning all through the reigns of Elizabeth and the Stuarts to adapt pottery to drinking and eating purposes, and the London and Bristol potters were learning to copy the tin enamel dishes from Delft and the stoneware drinking mugs from the Rhine. The ideas which Holland and Germany had passed on to London found their way at last to North Staffordshire. In that narrow area were to be found the requisites needed for a manufacture: the clays to make, the coals to fire, the men with experience. All that was still needed was the artist and experimental chemist. It might even be said that the artists were already there, and in a sense they were.